my shelf actually looks pretty good. And we're going to talk a little bit about these guys because I want to know how many of you are actually using this. I talk about these on the Pro Photo Show podcast. I mention them in my different videos and workshops, and you see them when I'm showing you work. A lot of times when I go out on a portrait session or something like that, I pull out a vintage lens and I'm doing it side by side. And something else I'm doing now, and I'll show you the collection here in a second. Something else I'm doing now is I'll take these vintage lenses and put them on their original cameras. So I have a Minolta SRT 202 here, which is a tank of a 1970s premium 35 millimeter camera. And I use the Minolta rocker lenses a lot. You can get these fairly readily available for fairly cheap. Something like the 50 millimeter rocker 1.4 is a great vintage lens to start. What's happening, and I shoot these with film, right? Because then I can do side by side with film. What's happening, if you go back, right? Let me flip the camera. If you go back to the old days of when we were shooting just digital SLRs or SLRs, real SLRs, right? And then we went to digital SLRs, like the 5D Mark II here that I've converted to infrared. And we take things like EF lenses. The vintage lenses, like an old FD lens, you couldn't just bolt directly on because you had to adapt the mount and the flange had to work out. Then when we switched to mirrorless cameras, like the Fujis, like the Sonys, right? We could do adapters. And you could take all these adapters like these and take all these vintage lenses, and you can buy these adapters for like $20 for each camera and lens combination, right? So I can say, hey, give me a Minolta FD or a Canon FD to a Canon EF to a Fuji, etc. Because the distance is different on the mirrorless camera. So when these mirrorless cameras became a thing, it opened up this huge new era of being able to take all that old glass that was kind of useless and made it super valuable again. So I can get the character of like a Canon FD 1.4 50 mil FSC, and 50 mils tend to be the favorite among vintage lenses. There's certainly lots of other ones, but your best priced vintage lenses, sharp, fast, like f1.4s, you can get f1.4s all day long on vintage glass in a Canon, in a Minolta, in a Pentax, Takumar for $50 to $100, and get this gorgeous manual focus lens that is amazing on video, that is amazing for portraits, and that just is really versatile. You can use it for street photography. Does that mean I always want to have a manual focus lens? I mean, no. One of my most used cameras that I thought never would be is an X100 Fuji fixed lens camera, because it just works so good. The quality is so good, and it's compact, and I can throw it in my cup holder in the car and have it with me all the time. But vintage glass brings this whole other perspective. So I can take a street camera like this, like a Canonet G3QL, right? This is also a fixed lens, and roll side by side with that Fuji X100 and get a really amazing result. Also with it, I actually just got this one, so I haven't gone out shooting with it yet. I have been taking this out. This is cool, and I use this for not only slowing down, because film makes you slow down, it makes you think more, but obviously I don't shoot film all the time because a roll of film now costs $20, $30. So it's absolutely insane. 4x5, I love shooting 4x5, but it's so expensive. The Polaroid XX70 is a great classic camera that's beautiful, a little hard to shoot with, slow ISO. I love the black and white film on it because it just looks great. But if I take a vintage lens like this Minolta rocker, okay, I can take a Minolta rocker, shoot it on its original camera, and do some film at a portrait session, because then I'm going to turn around, I'm going to use that film to do tests for Filmus, to improve things like Portra, like Ektar in my Filmus presets. Because we can't afford, most of us, and it's not practical, to shoot real film every day. So I can shoot film because it's great, it's aesthetic, there's something magical about it, but then I can come back, and by doing this, I can actually use the same rocker. I can be out in the field shooting with a Fuji XT, all right? Swap this vintage lens on it with an adapter, and then put that same vintage lens on its original camera on 35 millimeter film, and now have the same glass, the same settings, the same scene on a piece of film, on silver, and on digital raw. And now I can be comparing those side by side, which for me is really cool for improving Filmus presets. because that film look really gets us away from this overcooked, oversaturated everything, lifted shadows. If you guys have been to my Shadow Hackers workshop, if you follow my YouTube channel over at Seim Studios right here, hit the bell icon, like. You guys know if you've been to my Shadow Hackers workshop that shadows are important, not driving the sliders, not overcooking everything. That's one of the reasons I go to film as presets so often. Film is cool, but it's not just to be hipster. When you go to an authentic film profile, it tones down your edit and makes it more authentic, and you start seeing things differently. Just like also if you shoot real film, you slow down, you kind of transform the way you think, and you shoot digital better when you shoot film. If you guys leave a comment, let me know what vintage lenses, what film cameras you still use. I know most of us are not like, oh, I only shoot film, I'm a purist, I go out every day. No, I'm going to shoot film, I'm going to scan it, I'm going to use Lightroom on it, I'm still going to use presets on it, but I'm also going to use it to really get back to those basics of not overdoing things, because digital, we overdo things so much. And this is something that comes up in my workshops a lot, in the videos here on the channel a lot when I'm talking about shadow hunting. And of course in my Shadow Hunters workshop. Go to simfx.com/shadowhackers if you've never been to my free for now Shadow Hackers workshop, because it'll change the way you think about this stuff. But okay, vintage cameras, vintage lenses. This is my latest acquisition right here. Even though I can't change the lens on this, I'm going to be doing some street photography with this beauty. It even has the original instruction manual. And you know why? You know what I look for when I'm shopping for a vintage camera? I think I have it here. It's ugly as heck. This is the case, the original case for this camera. Completely beat up, garbage, smelly, okay? Doesn't smell good. You know that smell, that musty old leather case smell from a box of stuff. But here's the thing. When I see a camera like this in a case and the camera's inside it, I'm like, yes. They bought it. They didn't even use it enough to like lose the original case. It was just sitting in its original case. And when I see a camera like that sitting in its original case, it usually is a gorgeous camera. This one even had the original Candlelight flash, missing the battery cover, and I probably won't use it, but it looks good on the shelf. The camera I will definitely use, just like I've been frequently using this on my sessions. And when I'm doing portrait sessions lately, I try to take out the Minolta, and I'm doing side-by-side film tests with the digital, and that's really cool. And I've also been using the SX70 a lot. So vintage glass and film kind of coming into play here, but I've been using the SX70 a lot because it's just it's a true glass lens. It's an SLR. I mean, the newer plastic Polaroids, they just don't compare to this. And this thing was, I believe, the first ever autofocus camera. This is a sonar autofocus mechanism. It works pretty good, actually. It's surprisingly good, but it doesn't always nail it. Make sure that's not going to fall off the shelf. It doesn't always nail it. And so, yes, sometimes I do other things, right, in manual focus. Other things that are kind of got vintage feel is the Instax prints. Instax Mini, Instax Wide. I'm going to start working with an Instax Wide because printing things, putting them up, putting in them on your tables, on your walls. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You have more die sub kind of little printers. There's the Canon selfie printers. And then, of course, there's larger printers like I have over there on the desk, my larger format printers. But just printing your stuff. I love wall portraits. I've taught wall portraits for a long time as a photographer, but just printing your stuff, even if it's on Instax, Polaroid it has its own vintage lens aesthetic because it's not digital. A lot of these newer Fuji cameras, like the Fuji Instax, are taking a digital photo and then just printing it on an emulsion on Instax paper, which is beautiful because it's actually a real emulsion, right? It's a real development process. It's not a dye sub. Those are always they're cool, but the prints are never that impressive to me. So I'll use an Instax printer to print from my X100V to make cool little prints that have that real nice feel to them. But on a Polaroid, even though the quality that you get isn't the same as like an SLR, because there's so much, you have to be so stable and all this stuff going on. It's almost like shooting large format. It's not quite 4x5 level, but it's about 3x3, right? A Polaroid is about 3x3. So if I take a Polaroid, there's an aesthetic to it. Let me pull one out here. I like the black and white better than the color on the SX70 because the SX70 color, it's really cool, but it definitely has that vintage 60s kind of vibe. So if I'm shooting film or if I'm shooting Polaroid, there's something special about it because you're not just taking a tiny 1-inch sensor, you're actually projecting it. So it's actually a large format process where you get a completely different feel in the focal plane, right? Whereas a tiny sensor works and then you blow it up. When you're shooting a big sensor, you're using a different focal length, you're using a completely different focal plane, and it gives you a certain depth, kind of like a wet plate kind of feel. That's why I love the black and white on the SX70, because it almost feels like a wet plate collodion or something like that. And I study those a lot too, because I make those looks in the platinum emulsion actions. But you can't actually replace the size of the focal plane unless you actually go to a large format, because a small sensor, a 35 millimeter sensor, gives that aesthetic, and a large sensor gives, or a large focal plane on film gives that aesthetic. I don't know if I'm making sense with this. I may not be explaining this very well. We'll talk about it on the Pro Photo Show podcast one of these times. But I just wanted to kind of show you guys what I'm doing. The beauty of all this stuff is this collection of vintage glass and vintage cameras. I've just gradually been building them up. And so all my vintage glass you see here costs, and vintage cameras, I probably spent no more on than a single G Master or red line lens for Canon, right? Because we can spend thousands of dollars on lenses. Like, what did I pay for my 24 millimeter tilt shift, which is getting vintage now because it's EF, but I can mount this on the mirrorless because this is EF. I love the EF lenses still, because you can get an EF lens and use it on other cameras, not just Canon. You can even get autofocus adapters and use your EF lens on your Sony. Is it a little slower? Yeah. But when I first switched to Sony full frame mirrorless from Canon, I just kept using all my Canon lenses. And I just got an autofocus adapter, like a Metabones or something like that. And the cool thing is I can take this, which is manual focus anyway, one of my best landscape lenses ever, because it's razor sharp and it's tilt shift, so you can adjust it. But I can mount this to Fuji. I can mount this to Sony. And so these newer Canon lenses, when you buy a mirrorless lens, it's focal planed, its flange distance and everything is for a mirrorless lens. You can't just adapt that to any other camera. But when you have a 35 millimeter SLR lens, regardless of the gear, you can pretty much always adapt that to a 35 millimeter mirrorless. And it makes them actually really valuable. That's why you don't see the prices dropping on these that much, because these old lenses just get better and better. But obviously old vintage lenses like 50 primes and stuff like that, you can get very cheap because there were so many of them. Old vintage lenses that are more rare, like, wide angles, things like that are fast, those can still be very expensive actually. But 50 millimeter primes you can get all day long. Get yourself a Canon. I would say probably the favorite, go to 50 millimeter primes if you want to just adapt it to your Sony, to your Nikon, to your Fuji mirrorless, is the Rocker X lenses, like the Rocker 50 millimeter 1.4. I believe this was my first vintage lens, and it's great. The Pentax Takumars, like this Takumar here, and you can see this is with the adapter on it. This has a Sony adapter on it, and I can just unscrew it and put another adapter on it. But this is a Takumar SMC 50-1.4, also a very sharp, very phenomenal, fast 50 millimeter prime. So why not? How many guys are using vintage lenses? What vintage lenses are your favorite? And are you shooting film, or is it just us nerds on the internet talking about shooting film? I know it's expensive. I don't shoot a ton of film either, but I still love shooting film, and I am definitely enjoying Polaroid and doing it with the original vintage Polaroid SLR, which are a little hard. They're getting harder and harder to get, but you can still pick these up for a couple $100, and they're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. You're going to get a lot of failed shots on them. It's a slow ISO. Get some support. You're not going to be shooting in the dark and indoors. It's not going to work most of the time, but it's going to be really cool. All right, you guys, I'm going to go. I just wanted to go live for a few minutes and talk about it because I just cleaned up the shelf, and I thought, let's look at the vintage stuff and talk about it a little bit and how it improves our photography. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you soon. All right, peace.